I think this patch might be exactly what Marvel Snap needs right now. It comes with nerfs to two of the most hated archetypes, a buff to a card that everyone was kind of interested in seeing again, and so much more. Let's start with the return of the king. Zabu is going to a 1/2 with an on reveal ability to give -1 cost to each 4 cost card in your deck. This is a very interesting card to me because it manages to mix what has been a powerful ability with a different twist on it that makes it a lot less consistent. With Zabu not being an ongoing card, this card is now very much dependent on the cards you are able to get in your deck. To me, what this card looks like is something of a Wiccan machine, perhaps a turn 3 Wiccan machine, which Zabu already sort of was, but it also has additional other upside. What this card enables is some very interesting full power combos that previously were not really possible, but now are at a lower investment cost. For example, playing something like Symbiote Spider-Man into Shuri for a double dose of doubling was a little bit harder to do before you had access to this card. However, the fact that you have to have those cards in your deck when you play this Zabu is a significant downside. It makes it a lot harder to actually count on what this card is going to do. What I'm wondering is where this card starts showing up. Because one of the things we've learned over the course of Marvel Snap, as it has evolved over years and years and years, is 1 cost cards that aren't really doing a lot are very hard to justify in terms of deck slots. It's hard to want to put a 1/2 that maybe will pay off into your deck. That is not to say that this is going to be a bad card or anything like that, but I do think that it might require a little more than people think. With this card being a 1/2, the instinct is to look at it and say, oh, it's so easy to get this into the deck. And it's easy to put it in your deck, but it's not easy, I think, to prove that it's better than any alternative. And what I need to see is a coherent game plan that this complements, that functions both with and without it. And I think that's actually going to be a little bit harder to find than you think. I am interested in the 4/7 Brigade, specifically Wiccan, I think, comes to mind as a card that might want this anyway. A lot of Wiccan decks were pretty interested in playing a lot of 1-drops in the first place, and so having a Zabu that helps get your Wiccan out early is definitely something that those decks probably can afford to do because they have a surplus of spots for 1-cost cards anyway. They're interested in playing this card because they're able to do so. As far as other decks, it's possible it ends up in Zoo, but Zoo is already sort of built such that it really just plays Ka-Zar on 4 and then Blue Marvel on 5, and it's not really gated. Its output isn't really gated based on that. What I want to know is, are any decks seriously going to use this? Are there going to be Zabu decks the way there used to be, or is this guy going to be a little bit more of a supporting character? Right now, my instinct leans supporting character, but I'm just waiting to see if someone comes up with something that I've missed. A much-needed nerf to a fairly problematic in terms of metagame role deck, although not one that is overwhelmingly powerful. Hellcow is now going to only discard 1 card instead of 2, and that is honestly quite a big deal. The buff to Hellcow, enabling it to be a card that Hela played, is really what dragged Hela back into relevance. This is the kind of thing that can let the deck still exist, but in a much reduced form. In the notes, they note specifically that what's problematic about Hela is her play rate. The fact that she's not bad enough for people to switch off of the deck because it's just good enough and you just don't think enough that you are able to win. Hela is a deck that I've had a fairly complex relationship with. It's probably the #1 deck in Marvel Snap that has gotten me the most upset over the years. I personally think that the problematic aspects of the card are more along the lines of the playstyle it engenders. A fully turn 6, fully random, yes or no, binary type of card does not seem like the most fun gameplay. It's not like it's the worst thing ever to exist, but it, combined with several other aspects of the metagame, has made the most recent meta one of my least favorite in recent memory. This, combined with Clog especially, has created dynamics where the games either end with a big point explosion on turn 6 or on turn 4, where the game is actually over, you just don't want to admit it. And that specific dynamic, the fact that like there are multiple decks you can play, but most of them fall into either turn 6 point explosion or Clog deck that wants to prevent turn 6 point explosion, that dynamic has been present and unpleasant, for me at the very least. I think that Marvel Snap is at its best when there is a middle ground being broached between those dynamics, and spoiler alert, both of them are getting hit here. Hela's issue is that it is such an easy deck to leverage and play and put together, and it is such a deck that has such a high output, right? So when Hela is an important part of the meta, the output that other decks are required to have in order to compete is dragged upwards or downwards in the context of Clog. This dichotomy, the gap in point output, I think is the problem with Hela. And I think that they are able to see that and address it with a change like this. The output of the deck will be meaningfully reduced by this. This is a change that hurts the overall output of the deck. I don't think it actually makes the deck unplayable, it just makes it worse. You're still going to beat the same kind of dinky mid-range decks with Hela that you were previously, because it is still absolutely good enough to do that. I do think that it's possible this is a bit of an over-nerf to a deck that is functionally probably about 50% win rate. The issue is they don't have a lot of other levers to pull. The issues that this card creates in Hela are ones of output, and I think that is the right way to aim this. And because they don't have other levers, like, what are you going to do? Take points off of this? They don't care about the points on any of the cards other than the ones they're discarding. You added the lever to Hela to enable you to manage that, but now they're playing Luke Cage, so you can't manage that. There just aren't a lot of levers to pull, and frankly, it felt like it was between this and Blade for what had to happen to make this deck a little bit weaker, and I'm glad they arrived at a similar conclusion to me, because I think this is the right thing to do. Speaking of the right thing to do, White Widow was a card that I was afraid of before it came out, I was afraid of after it came out, and has sort of changed everyone's perception of what Clog can be, to the point of really being the sort of defining card of the archetype. Is it the best card in the archetype? I think probably, yes, but it is by all accounts the one that is the most generically applicable. What White Widow has enabled is a bunch of Clog splashes. You don't have to be a full Clog deck, and I think that is a bad dynamic for a card to enable. This change, allowing White Widow's Bite, or forcing White Widow's Bite to immediately get destroyed if they fill the lane up, is a good change. One upshot is White Widow into Red Guardian is now an immensely strong play, but you should have to work for it, and that was the issue with the old White Widow. You didn't have to work for it. She was elite stats for her cost, and she clogged your opponent up. And when you have something that is that powerful, and looking at you, Kate Bishop, who can do that half of the time, this is a problematic play pattern. And I think Clog as a whole has been up and down for a lot of people in Marvel Snap. But the number one thing that I think bothers me, we talked about the dichotomy, right? It's either turn 6 point explosion or a Clog deck built on preventing the turn 6 point explosion. It all sort of rotates outward from the turn 6 point explosion because that's the basis of Marvel Snap. The stakes double on turn 6, so obviously you want to have as much hidden information as possible. You want to have as many points as possible that your opponent can't interact with, right? That all makes sense. The issue is that Clog is and should be a good proactive strategy against that stuff. Here's the problem. You should have to work for it. The Clog cards that we had before White Widow, Debris, Green Goblin, Titania, you had to work for those. If you tried to play Debris, and there was a potential downside for you in that you got rocks. If you tried to play Green Goblin, there was a potential downside for you in that the Green Goblin could get stuck on your side of the board. Same for Hobgoblin. Titania, same thing. There is potential downside, and there should be potential downside in every one of these clog cards. In White Widow, there is no potential downside, or at least there wasn't. I don't know if this is the most elegant solution. I think it leans a little bit more towards just getting the card obliterated than it does creating something new. I do very much like the idea of White Widow into Red Guardian being this very powerful thing now, because I do think it is quite strong, but she loses a lot as a card that your opponent can easily remove from the board now. I'm not saying she's going to go away forever. My instinct is the numbers on this card are actually high enough that you probably will find a way to make this work. But what this does do is remove her, in my opinion, from the Clog archetype. She is no longer a card that you want to use with your other Clog cards, because then she's just going to blow up the Widow's Kiss. That is a good decision. Is it the best possible decision? I don't know. But I do think it's in, like, you know, the 80th percentile and above of things they could have done here. Because I think it would have been very easy to ignore this. I think it would have been very easy to look at this and say, look, it's good. Clog is holding back these turn 6 decks. That's a good thing that we want. And I'm glad they didn't ignore it. Because I think that between Clog and these turn 6 decks, the experience of Marvel Snap has degraded a little bit. Just my opinion, take it or leave it. And I like that they're addressing both of them. The other major nerf to Clog is a hit to Viper that I honestly think is long overdue. I understand why this didn't happen when they first changed Viper to target the lowest power card. That makes perfect sense to me. You don't want to give a card a cool new functionality at the same time as you give people a reason to not play it, like taking a point of power off, right? We have seen taking a point of power off artificially drop play rate of cards below what it should. That's not what they should have done at the time, but I do think that any of the last few OTAs could have contained this, and it would have been a good call then, and then it's still a good call now. Viper at 3/5 has absolutely no business being a 3/5. This is a card that has been incredibly powerful, incredibly strong, and just sort of an obvious, like, oh, why is that a 3/5 candidate? When you look at the 3/5s in the game, Viper does stick out as the one that helps you get rid of downsides and turn them into upsides. And I think that is a very strong thing to do. Getting rid of the hood and giving it to your opponent is not just a 6-point swing, it is also a clogged location. It's more than a 6-point swing, and it is the most common play made with this 3/5 body. And 3/5 has been the cream of the crop. I do not think they can go above 3/5 for anything with even a remote upside. I just don't think they can do it. I think they can have conditional go above 3/5s like Speed and Cassandra Nova, but I don't think they can print straight-faced a 3/6 with upside, meaning this is actually kind of the max stat line for a card with a good ability. And Viper has a very good ability, meaning there is absolutely no way that it should long-term stay at 3/5. This is an excellent choice. Frankly, you could have put this to 3/3 and I'd be saying all the same things that I'm saying right now. I think she's still probably fine. We've got a buff and a nerf alert here on Scream. Let's start with the bad news. Scream and Kingpin will no longer be affecting face-down cards. Juggernaut specifically was the card that would allow that to happen most of the time. That is no longer a part of what they do, and it is one of the stronger things that Scream and Kingpin could do. So, in exchange, they have compensated Scream by making her a 2/3. On the whole, I think this is a good solution. I expect tomorrow to see two reactions. The first one being, I can't believe they nerfed Scream, I need compensation. And the second one being, I can't believe they buffed Scream, they need to stop doing that, I need compensation. I think that, to be completely honest, that is a good thing. I think people taking both sides of that, oh man, I need compensation, oh man, I think that the fact that I didn't buy this and now I want it at a 2/3, I think that's exactly where you want to be when you're making a change like this. They explain in pretty clear detail what it is that actually prompted this. I am not sure exactly how much I buy it. Like, I get it, but maybe because of my card game background, I am a little bit more willing to just let the player base figure out why stuff like that works. But I think possibly in Marvel Snap, that is an incorrect decision. And because I come from Magic, because I come from Hearthstone, it is a little bit more like I expect things to work like that. And I think maybe in Marvel Snap, they don't. There is no expectation that things be weird and esoteric. Instead, the expectation is things should work the way you expect them to work. That being, you shouldn't be able to affect face down cards with anything that doesn't say you can affect face down cards, right? And that precedent, I think they felt was more important to establish because, okay, you afflict with Juggernaut and Kingpin a face down card. Why can't you do that with Hazmat? And when you actually try to answer that question, it's like, yeah, I understand why they'd want to make sure that that interaction is consistent with Hazmat and stuff like that. I get it. It makes perfect sense. I'm fine with it. It makes sense. Sure, I get it. I do think that I have a higher tolerance for this than they do, so I'm not going to make a value judgment on it. But what I will say is I'm very happy they were like, this seems like a reasonable nerf to this card. Let's just give her another point of power and see if we can offset that nerf. And I think that that is the right thing to do when you do something like this. We talked about how receiving nerfs, even though they're minor, can cause people to give up on cards. When we talked about Viper and why I think it was smart that they didn't put her to 3-4 immediately, but now is the right time to do it. This is the opposite situation. This card was getting a nerf, and now they're giving people an additional reason to keep on playing it. I think that's the right thing to do to reward the people who bought this card who would otherwise be put out by a removal of what is, frankly, a fairly important interaction for the card. I think it's actually up for debate as to whether or not this is a stronger card. I don't think the debate is very heated because, you know, that's 1.5 more points than it previously had, but I think you could actually have that debate. That said, I do think on the whole, Scream comes out of this a little bit stronger than she was. The Grandmaster is getting an additional point up to 3, and I am reminded of a thread I saw on Magic the Gathering Twitter, where people were talking about what card was released the furthest off from what it would have to be, or what it would be released at today. And I think Grandmaster might be a good candidate for this, because this card released at 2-0, was extremely hyped, and is now 2-3, and I'm still not sure if it's good. But I think at 2-3, we are really pushing into, okay, we've got to consider what this card can do territory. It is now no longer a negative. The biggest issue this card has now is that it's one of those 2-drops you don't really want to play until you're doing something really cool with it in the late game, right? And so a lot of the value of something being like a 2-3 is that you can just curve it out and you won't feel too stupid about it. But with this, the delta between actually getting the ability and not getting the ability is massive. It's US Agent-esque, where it's like, are you really going to give up on what the potential this card could represent in order to play a shocker, right? Is that really what you're going to do? Like, obviously, it's better that you have the option to play a shocker if you consider this like a double-faced card where it can either be shocker or, you know, something ridiculous at the end game. That is a better card than when it was a 2-2. There's no argument about that. The issue is, how strong will this be? Because when I look at this card at 2-3, I think, okay, this card is actually probably good now. I find it hard to believe that it's just actively bad. It is, at the very least, this card is no longer a joke. If you get Grandmastered and you're like, who plays the Grandmaster? I would expect that to not be the kind of question you need to ask. Like, this is a card you're going to have to respect now. You're going to have to think about this card existing. It can do very strong things. Doubling up on Sage, Shang-Chi, Shadow King. Very, very powerful. It is unfortunate that this nerf comes right as the time where Cosmo being part of the metagame is sort of cresting to a peak, but that is sort of the nature of the game. Is this a good move? I don't know. I think that this is the kind of card that can create some not amazingly fun gameplay, and because of that, I think that, you know, maybe it's not necessarily the best thing to continue buffing it up to this line, but I think they're interested in seeing what this guy can be and what they have to do to actually get a card to that level. They're clearly interested in the text box this card has. They've basically put variations of it on multiple cards since, right? Or not since, but like you have Absorbing Man, you have Misery. There is some desire for exploration of repeating effects, and I think it is probably worth it to figure out what are the lines for this kind of text box. What is the strongest we can make one of these cards? And I think Misery is a good way of figuring that out. I think the Grandmaster is a good way of figuring that out. I honestly expect this card to be kind of good. I expect it to be a little bit niche, a little bit specific, but I expect it to be a relevant and good card that you should, at this point, no longer make fun of people for running. It's no longer like, oh my god, I can't believe they're playing the Grandmaster, which even at 2-2, I think you could argue it was. I think at 2-3, this is just a good card, and you have to respect that. There is a contingent of Marvel Snap players that are very, very against the idea of cards that are not in caches getting buffs. This is one of those situations where I think that they will not necessarily be making the same noise. This is Emperor Hulkling going from 6'11 to 6'12. I don't know if that does anything for this card. I remember saying before release that it would need to be a 6'13 for me to be actually really scared of it. And that was in a metagame where 6-drops were very good. We were in the middle of the Wiccan metagame where people were actually endgaming 6-drops, right? And that metagame hasn't existed since, in part due to Hela. And now we have a very different metagame where the ceiling that things need to actually get to almost precludes playing a 6-12 at all. It's very hard for you to win games of Marvel Snap when you're playing a 6-12 and they're playing a 4-power Iron Man that only costs 3 energy because it's actually a Mystique. That's not a good thing for you to try to beat. It's hard for you to beat even like an Ajax with most of the rolls that you'll get off of this guy. It's not impossible, but it is kind of hard. 6-drops have gone in and out of the metagame. 6-drops as a relevant card type sort of move in and out depending on what else is happening, because when you are in these fair metas where Alioth is gatekeeping everything, then you are suddenly able to play these big dumb stat sticks because they're good into Alioth, right? When you're in these unfair metas where people are dumping, 57 power on the board on the final turn of the game, where people are playing 2 Iron Men and both of them have 4 power, when people are playing a final turn of Mysterio, except they're all 4 power, and then a bunch of free 1-drops and then a Hit Monkey, it's hard to play a 6-12. We're not in a 6-12 meta right now. Now, when we get back to one of those, will this card be a little more interesting? Maybe. It might be. I still think it's probably a little bit below where it needs to be if it wants to be a real contender in those metagames, but it's a little bit closer. And I do think there is legitimate value in the card like this being leveraging what we'll talk about as variants, right? This is a card that gives you snaps that otherwise you would not be able to get. And that is a really, really, really good thing for you to have. Will it push it above Magneto? Probably not. Is Magneto even very good right now? Also no. So that the point is almost moot until we're in a different metagame, but I don't expect Emperor Hulkling to move that far up the 6-drop tier list. And we're not really in a 6-drop meta anyway. Do you know how long I've been waiting for this? Okoye with the buff to 2-3. I made a video 6 months ago? The same video where I was like, they should buff Claw by 2 points. They should buff the Ultron drones to 2. They should buff Miles to 4-6 or put him to 0. I said they should put Okoye to 2-3. And I am finally rewarded for this. I think if I had to guess, probably because when you look at this and then you look at Agent Venom, you're just like, okay, that's, come on now, right? I think that this timing is very, I'm not going to say suspicious, because that implies that it's like, oh, I'm sniffing out wrongdoing. It's not wrongdoing. It's just when you make a card like Agent Venom, it's very hard to look at Okoye and be like, yeah, people should play this. It's just, no, they shouldn't. Come on now. And even at 2-3, I don't know that they should. I remember what I pitched actually was Okoye to 1-1, I want to say. So she could be a part of bounce decks. I thought that would be a cool thing, like it was in the beta. I don't know if they can do that, but I am I would be interested in trying to see it. I think they've opted for a little bit of a softer buff here because Okoye is part of the new player experience. You don't necessarily want like 1/1 Okoye, which is like way stronger than a bunch of the other one drops. Compare when you play it on turn 1, it's just gonna be like a 1/6, and that's just like way bigger than anything else, right? And so 2/3 Okoye, a little bit more manageable, a little bit more understandable. This is a 2-cost card. It's just a little bit easier for this card to exist than, like, say, 1/1 Okoye, I think. But maybe I'm wrong about that, and they should have made it 1/1. I think that's the only real qualm I have here is, did they go far enough here? And when I look at Okoye, I think, probably not, but it's not like this card is bad. Like, again, shocker, but you have perma upside on it. Like, it's not a bad card. It really isn't. It's just a little bit mopey, and we're in a metagame that is anything but. It's possible in a world where mopiness comes back, like, this is a card we actually consider. There's one other aspect of this that really sticks out to me, and it's that, like, good cards decks are losing White Widow, right? And I'm not necessarily opposed to investigating this as, like, the next up best 2-drop, right? It turns out there's not actually a lot of competition there. When you look at, like, good 2/3s, it's like, oh man, I want a 2/3 that I'm happy to play on 2, and there aren't really all that many of those, and maybe this card is actually that card now. I don't know. I think, it's likely that it'll get overshadowed by Agent Venom even so, but I am at least a little bit interested in, this is now a card I can consider as opposed to a card I would basically never consider. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through this video. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I have a lot of hope for this OTA, to be honest with you. One of the things that I was really worried about was the following sequence of events, which is this meta keeps on as it has been with these sort of unpleasant play patterns of turn 6 dump and various clog shenanigans, and then Pokemon Pocket comes out, and then a bunch of people go play Pokemon Pocket, and then, whether or not it actually is something that they're all really happy about, what I was worried about was anyone leaving to play Pocket because the meta is bad comes back and then they find themselves in an acquisition hole. I think that would be a very bad sequence of events. And I think step 1 to fixing that obviously would be to fix acquisition, but step 2 would be, okay, we need to have Marvel Snap be a game that is fun to play right now. And that means removing some of the stuff that people hate. And I am glad that it finally hit on their balance thresholds, because I don't think they would have done this if it was just stuff people didn't like. I think they did this because it was also actually good. And we're just sort of lucky about the timing here, because I had some fear for, like, okay, well, if the metagame's really awful, if the actual experience of playing Marvel Snap is really not great, then that is the wrong situation to be in when a competitor releases. And I'm a YouTuber. I'm an idiot. I'm not a game dev. I'm not any of this crap. But it does stick out to me when it feels like the time when you least want your metagame to be bad is the time when a competitor is coming out. And I am glad that they seemingly are taking steps to address this. Probably, I don't know if they're on purpose, but I'm glad that they're happening, because the Clog Hela dynamic is the kind of thing that gets old really quick. And I'm sure we'll all find something to complain about in the future. I'm sure we'll all find something else to be mad about. Lord knows, I was probably more mad over the last month than I think I ever have been. And, it doesn't really show on YouTube, but if you stopped into any of my streams, you probably would have seen it. And so I'm very hopeful moving forward. And I, obviously, that's not all on them, right? Like, obviously, I have to manage that myself. But it is something that I'm grateful for. So hopefully this patch does what I want it to and makes the meta just a little bit more normal and a little bit less all or nothing blah. And I hope you feel the same way. As always, I've been Cam Best. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.